Welcome to the Lighthouse Community Foundation's inaugural event, Canada's Free Speech Crisis. I am Chris Costa. I am one of the directors at the Lighthouse Community Foundation, and I have been a member of the Lighthouse Network since 2021. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been a great turnout for the event, which I suppose it's unsurprising given the current political climate and the widespread concerns over free speech in our country. I'm looking forward to the talks this evening, as I'm sure you all are too, but first, just a little bit of housekeeping. I know you've had a lot of time to drink, sorry for the delays, but the bar downstairs will remain open throughout the evening. If you're feeling thirsty, feel free to make your way down. You can head through the stairs. There's stairs on your right over here, or at the front of the building where you came in. Obviously, you can go down there too. There are also two bathrooms downstairs, both at the front and at the back, but we will be taking a short intermission about halfway through, and if you choose to refresh yourself at that time, you can also do that. I am going to hand the mic over to Catherine Cronus. She's the founder of the Lighthouse Network, but before I do, I'd like to express a few thank yous. First and foremost, thank you to Joe and Vince and Dave and everyone here at Revival. Thank you for working with us to host our first event, for making the space beautiful, for making the logistics work. It's a perfect venue. You've all been so courteous and accommodating. Thank you. Thank you to our speakers, Meghan, for working closely with me in the ideation and piecing together of important aspects of this event. Thank you to Bruce, Trish, and Jonathan for agreeing to be a part of this discussion and for taking the time to think deeply about this important topic. Thank you to our event donor, Brian Vincent, whose financial support enabled us to get this event off the ground in the first place. And thank you to everyone who donated a little bit on top of their ticket to the Lighthouse Foundation. It might seem like nothing to you, but every small contribution adds up, and cumulatively, it has allowed us to run this event and hopefully do more in the future. Finally, a heartfelt thank you to all the members of the Lighthouse Network. Your support, positive encouragement, and constructive criticisms mean a great deal. A special appreciation goes out to Melanie and Rex, and also Andrea and Yelena, who I've just met today, who graciously stepped forward to offer their assistance tonight as volunteers. Within and beyond the Lighthouse community, including our panelists, but also many people who are here in the audience, I extend my gratitude to all of those who have been trailblazers in the public square. Many of you started speaking up about pressing issues. You started sounding the alarm over the erosion of our civil rights. You exposed the spread of toxic ideologies within our institutions and the blatant injustices committed under the guise of virtue and social justice. Some of you have lost your jobs. You have endured vicious witch hunts and threats of violence. You have sacrificed relationships with loved ones in order to speak the truth and stand up for fundamental principles that should govern a free society. Your courage, demonstrated long before it was popular, has been both inspiring and contagious, and I thank you for your unwavering commitment. You know who they are sitting among us. Can we please offer a round of applause to all these individuals? Without further ado, I would like to introduce Catherine Cronus. Catherine is the founder of the Lighthouse Network, which for many of us was a desperately needed community and an indispensable light in the darkness when the world seemed bleak and we were all losing hope. She ran for school board trustee in 2022 in Hamilton Wentworth on a Stop Woke platform. She has been a positive force in Canada and a major advocate for classical liberal values and free speech. Please join me in welcoming Catherine Cronus.
Hi. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. But thank you, Chris, for all your hard work and efforts in organizing this event tonight. This is, mostly her work, and thank you for bringing us all together. You've done an amazing job bringing us all together, and I'm really excited to see how this event unfolds. I don't know about you, but not too long ago, I was feeling very alone. I was alarmed what I was seeing happening in public education and our institutions, and I was dying to get involved and looking for a group to help me to direct my energy. I couldn't find any, so I decided to found Lighthouse in the spring of 2021 with a mission to connect to like-minded individuals, people like you. Lighthouse was conceived as a network of parents and educators across the country who wish to oppose woke ideology in education. We are individuals who champion freedom of expression and represent a diverse set of views. We don't all agree on everything, and we don't think the same, but I've talked to hundreds of people over the course of a couple of years, and I have found that there is something in common with Lighthouse members. One, we are seeking community. I've seen incredible friendships and collaborations develop. A number of organizations and initiatives have spawned or been supported through the connections made in Lighthouse. Two, we're knowledgeable about the problems we face and are aware of the breadth, the totality, and the seriousness of what we are facing. And so we care. We care and are committed, and we're motivated to act in our advocacy for the well-being and safety of children, for individual rights, and to protect free speech. And finally, I would say we're curious and passionate about learning more, which is why we're here tonight. I still consider myself a student on the contentious issues of our times, and I can't wait to hear what the panelists share with us tonight, and I'm definitely eager for some challenges to my current thinking on some of these matters. So let's get on with things. Please welcome tonight's moderator. He's a Quillette editor and podcast host, a TEDx speaker, and a member of the advisory board for FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and a board game and disc golf aficionado. Please welcome Jonathan Kay.
Hi, this is a great crowd. I was skeptical when they asked me to be moderator what the crowd would be like, because it's like, you know, usually several people have said no before they get to me. So, and I'm delighted to share the stage with three smart people. I should warn you, being a moderator does not always come natural to me. You have to be the adult in the room. For those who follow me on social media, that is not my forte. You know, I kind of just make jokes on social media. I actually have neighbors who say, "Oh man, I love your stuff." And I say, "Well, what stuff are you talking about?" He says, "You know, Twitter." And I say, "You know I'm a journalist and stuff." I say, "Oh, really? That's great. That's awesome. Yeah, so you've expanded from just tweeting about fast food." So at this point, I just want to ask, have to do it. If there's anybody here who's here to protest stuff, so they're like going to throw paint on the wall, or you want to like chain yourself to something, or like accuse us of committing genocide, like, can you do it now? Because, and first get your parking validated. Because it's awkward when you're chained up and you're like, can you just like, so no, so last call, no paint, no chains, no genocide. Okay, good. It's a heartless, social justice-free crowd, I see. Just the way I like them. So I should also say that in my capacity as moderator, I'll be trying to elicit an exchange of views, which, you know, I mean, sometimes you get panels like this. It's great that everyone is a free speech supporter, but also, like, one of the functions of these panels is to try and draw out some of the nuances, which sometimes can mean playing devil's advocate. So if you see me affecting the role of maybe a more progressive-minded dogmatist. Like that's me playing a role, folks. That's still me. And just in terms of the structure, we're going to have some, I wouldn't call them formal speeches, but Meghan, Trish, Bruce, they're going to set out their views in this kind of a systematic way for 10 or 15 minutes, or a little longer. And then after that, we'll get into a kind of moderated discussion. And then, as was already mentioned, we're going to have a break, a little bit more discussion, and then we're hoping to hear from the audience, because that's often the best part of these things. And so our first speaker is going to be Trish Wood. Yeah. Trish is a real journalist, used to work at the CBC, and this was like the CBC. Wait, whoa. I knew I'd get that. That's why in my notes I said, do not pause at that point, because people are just gonna... This was the CBC we knew and loved before it became like a college radio station for Ryerson graduates. And Trish, yes, and Carleton. Trish worked at the Fifth Estate, which was, and I think remains, a real investigative journalistic show. I learned this, shares the same hairdresser as Mary Lou Finley from As It Happens. So very, very branché. And now runs a podcast that apparently I once was on the podcast. It's Trish Wood is Critical. So if you want to hear more, yep. And without further ado, please take the podium.
Whoever booed out there at the Fifth Estate, the line that usually follows my saying that to people is something like, back when that meant something, which it doesn't anymore, but I get it. And just to kind of follow up on that a bit too, people ask me this a lot. I'm really proud of the work we did then. I left in 1999. We got Clayton Johnson out of jail. He didn't murder his wife. We exposed Carla Homolka for who she really was. We did a lot of pharmaceutical products liability stories. And the show, actually, this is interesting. That show, it was not me, it was Lyndon McIntyre, but was the place that did the investigative work that exposed the Kuwaiti incubator story to be a fraud that they'd set up in order to lure America into the war by saying that the Iraqis were unplugging incubators. And what it turned out to be was that the woman who told the story to the American Congress was the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter. And it was all a big lie. So we were doing good work then, it mattered. But they wouldn't do those stories now. So they would do that story, but there are many stories we did then that they would not do now. And I learned that mostly around covering COVID-19, where they just failed on every single marker of journalism on the way they covered that. I'm still kind of in a state of shock over it. My world has been completely unsettled by surviving long enough to see the business that I loved destroy itself, and it has done that. And what we're talking about free speech tonight, and obviously the opposite of that is censorship, and I want to start by saying that it's obviously a really serious topic, and what I lived through starting in March of 2020 when I started the podcast. I started it because I knew they were going to get COVID wrong. I'd covered Tony Fauci in the 80s during AIDS, and he was worthy of limited respect then. And I saw the train coming down the track. I was looking at the data, reading Johnny and Edie's, understanding it was a super stratified risk that they weren't taking into account, all the stuff we know now. And I kept hoping that legacy media was going to pick up the ball and run with it, and they never did. And I realized after about 2 years of lockdown in Ontario that legacy media's inability to cover that story critically and objectively. Stories that would question the narrative that was stitched together by public health on nonsense. It killed people, right? People committed suicide. Kids are ruined for life, some of them, because of their schooling being disrupted the way that it was. Cancer screenings didn't happen. Deaths of despair were everywhere. Families were broken apart. Legacy media drove us apart over whether or not we were vaccinated. And I think when history looks back on that time, they're going to say, what the hell happened there? And I will tell you something, I don't have an answer for it. I think there was probably a level of mass hysteria underfoot. I'm interviewing a neurologist this week whose thesis, and it's not Matthias Desmond, it's someone else, but whose thesis is that people who are subjected to a fire hose of propaganda and lies actually lose cognitive function, right? Our brains change and adapt to the stimuli in ways that are not good for us. And I believe it because I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel changed. I feel rattled. I have anxiety now. And it's not for any specific reason that I can think of, but when I heard about this person, Naomi Wolf wrote a Substack about him. I think she wrote the intro to his book too. It really made sense for me. We've been through something, right? We've endured something. And when I'm in rooms like this with people who are trying to figure it out, I feel something that I now call trucker energy. Yes. And I go to these things frequently, and the trucker energy is about, for me, it was absolute hopelessness, despair, some suicidal thoughts, because we couldn't get out of it. The media wasn't going to let us out of it, right? We were locked down forever. And I thought that nobody thought the way that I did until they happened. So that really changed things for me. And these rooms full of people who are trying to figure out, lots of you have suffered and struggled. What's happened to us, something has happened. My friend CJ Hopkins from Berlin says, Trish, the bad thing's already happened, right? We just have to figure out now what we're going to do about it, and I think he's right. And much of what he believes and I believe comes down to communication and our absolute right to free speech, not just in the public square, but even in our doctors' offices, being that truncated is killing democracy and us, I think, slowly. I also want to shout out Rupa Subramanya, who should be here. She's a funny old thing. Who do the Americans want? When they want a country where things are so screwed up, they're sending their journalists down to address government as a warning. Where do they go? They go to Canada. I mean, this is really a bad look. Anyway, she did a bang-up job, and I'm proud of her. I'm working on a film right now with Tamara Leach and Chris Barber. Yeah. And they are who they appear to be. They are solid, true blue, amazing blue-collar Canadians who spoke truth to power and are on trial for it in Ottawa right now, as are 4 people in Coutts, Alberta, who are still in jail after almost 2 years or something like that for protesting. So anyway, I'm doing a film. I just came back from there literally yesterday after doing some interviews, and I think for me the darkest moment was when I saw the kind of the end of the protest, right? They kept winning on every idea. If they took their gas away, people brought gas cans. If they took their food away, people brought food. If they closed down one funding platform, another one would spring up and it would fill up with $9 million. Imagine how threatening that was to the Prime Minister. And imagine, if you will, just for a minute, what he did just to bring this back to the idea of propaganda and free speech. And that is that the minute that they hit the road, before they even got to Ottawa, he had started this smear campaign. So, and nobody in the media said, well, where's your evidence for that? What is your proof that they are what you are alleging that they are? That didn't happen. It just became, a truth that was spoken about them by people in media, and the people in Ottawa came to believe it. And it was very, very difficult for them because the city had an idea of who they were, which was not actually who they were. And then the stories started about them, and there were some significant ones. One was a story that they had committed arson. These two truckers were lighting a fire in a building, and someone asked them who they were, and they said, oh, we're truckers. And then the woman who asked them went upstairs and went to bed instead of calling, like, really? And and I think it was Global, or was it CTV? Somebody did if you're here, sorry, but really. I mean, and that went around Parliament, media, the mayor's office, the police station. It was, on its face, it was a garbage story. I called the police officer who was investigating the arson story, and he said, we don't think it's the truckers at all. It can't be them. We have reason to believe it's not them. And no one ever bothered to call. So still we're hearing in the house, arson, arson, arson. The other one was the funny money coming up from the Proud Boys or the MAGA people. Bad money coming. And the head of, I think it's called FinTrack, RCMP, the money guys, the finance guys, testified at the POEC, no, nothing like that, nothing at all. CBC said it was a Putin operation. Nobody got fired for that. Nobody said, why are you saying that? Where's your evidence? She just said it. So all of those things that were said about this really important initially blue-collar movement were lies meant to silence them and to impugn their credibility. And they did sort of a good job. I mean, if you're in Ottawa now, as we have been on this shoot, there are many, many people in that town who think that the truckers were, the second coming of Freddy Krueger. I mean, they really think that. And they all have a folk tale. Like, one of them said, you've heard the story about the pickup truck full of bombs and guns that they, and I said, well, if that happened, wouldn't the police have charged them with something? And wouldn't that have come out of oh no, my uncle's cousin's father, it's like this weird, and they all have those things. And it's, like I said, it's a kind of mental illness, right? I think they can't believe that the prime minister, who is pretty popular in that town still, if anybody can believe it, would do what he did, which is just make stuff up in that way. So in order to kind of keep the hatred of a populist movement going, they kind of invent their own stories and come to, it's kind of like the witch trials or something, but Meghan knows about that, right? She'll tell us all about that. I wonder where that leaves us at the end of the day. If people can't honorably do what they did, which is protest something that they were actually right about, they were right to protest those things, and they were right to try to bring us back together again and try to mend the terrible division. I don't know if any of you saw the Toronto Star anti-vaxxer. This is an oldie but goodie, this thing. And people around the world, they ask me about it. People talk about it. It was a full page of anti-vaccine porn. Like we don't think they should have medical care. We don't think they should live. And they did apologize for it, but no one wants an apology. But what that does is it tells you what's in the mind of the people working at the newspapers who are supposed to be holding power to account on your behalf, right? And they weren't doing that. And I will never understand, Rodney Palmer has a better idea of why that happened than I do, but I'll never understand why they did that, because going all in on a vaccine that hasn't been tested that well is stupid, right? So you could argue, give the vaccine to people who are probably going to die if they get COVID. Sure, okay, it's experimental, let's do it. But the push that everybody needed to get it, that kids who had no chance of dying of COVID had to be vaccinated, that if you didn't do it, you're a bad person, that is really crazy stuff in the annals of medicine. Like, I've never seen anything like that, and I don't understand why the media would play along with it. So I followed through, I started my podcast, I followed through pretty traumatic events and ended up getting to know the Great Barrington Declaration guys and women really well, and especially Jay Bhattacharya, who is a friend. And they dropped this wonderful document that said, okay, COVID is really age stratified, right? It mostly kills old people with a comorbidity. So let's maybe let the other people do some things, but not lock them down. It's hurting them too much. We got to get things rolling again. So it seemed pretty reasonable to me. And even if that's wrong, these are like Harvard, Oxford, Stanford people. So, they're estimable, they're credentialed. But in order to keep the fake consensus going, from the I am the science guy, they were smeared and destroyed in ways that never dealt with the actual data and the science of the arguments they were making, right? They all were at what they call ad hominem attacks. And Jay was massively shadow banned. Martin Kulldorff was kicked off of Twitter. YouTube wouldn't listen to them at all. And I thought, how can this be happening? So I think that was really a pivotal moment for everybody, especially people paying attention, because that really meant there was no way out, right? If the COVID dissenters and the dissenting media can't argue the science in a meaningful way, then it just sort of feels like they can do anything to us. I mean, literally, that's how I felt. And that's how I really was spiraling about that and struggling with what's happening to journalism, what's happening to science, how can this be real? And, people in my own family had some bad outcomes from the lockdowns, which I've talked about on the show. I won't talk about that here. But so when Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger did the Twitter files, they determined a bunch of things that should scare each and every one of us. And that is that government and bureaucrats were dialing up the social media platforms and demanding that they deplatform or throttle or whatever they were doing various people that made the government and the bureaucrats look bad. That is Soviet-era stuff. And what's interesting about what they discovered in the Twitter files and then what they call now the censorship industrial complex is that this is one of the biggest stories of our lifetime, and legacy media barely even touched it. I mean, they actually were kind of resentful of it in a way. I know that one of the things they determined, which I didn't understand, was that Stanford, which behaved very badly during COVID, it was one of the worst places, they have a department there called virality, and the virality department approached Twitter and demanded that vaccine negative effects be censored even if they were true, because they don't want to cause vaccine hesitancy. So, okay, we know it's causing issues, but we can't, I mean, how does a university do that? Yeah. Yeah. So that was one of the bad moments of the time. I'm going to wrap up, and here's the last thing I'll say. I was in Ottawa doing my trucker stuff, and I interviewed a trucker named Gord McGill, who writes for Newsweek. It's great, very smart guy. And I asked him about what he thought about the moment when the truckers came to kind of, shine a light for us on all the things we needed to see and the feelings we had, and to get us re-engaged and back into rooms like this with each other. And when he started to answer the question, I started crying because I felt so embarrassed. But I was back in those dark days again and remembering how completely grateful I was that those guys and women got in those trucks and did what they did, while a lot of people were kind of cowering and afraid or just numb by what was happening. So I think we can't forget that. Like, I'm afraid the truckers will pass away into history without us remembering how important they were on all of this against propaganda, for free speech, and enabling us to get back together in rooms like this again and see each other as people. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish. So our next speaker requires no introduction. So instead, I'll just tell a little story, which is that I knew Meghan Murphy before she was famous, before she was a headliner. I mean, the closest thing we have to a headliner tonight, let's be candid. And this was, I think, 2014, 2015, when you walked into the gin joint called The Walrus, which is, I used to work there. It's a Toronto area magazine. And I published your work. Yeah. So this was when Meghan it was another part of her life. She was young, she needed the money. She was working for Rabble.ca, which is still around. It's like this sort of like Cretaceous era left-wing website, and I think Meghan had just been like de-rabbled because she said that like 2 + 2 does not equal gender penis, and everyone got like really upset with her. And this is literally true. I remember where I was sitting in front of a computer in my very august office at the Walrus, where I wore a sash that said editor-in-chief of the Walrus. And I was editing this piece from Meghan, who like just walked in the front door. It was just like, wasn't a friend of a friend, it was just like, hi, are you? And Meghan taught me what turf meant. I never know. I remember I was sitting there. I says, "What is turf? Is that like some kind of fabric or something?" And she's like, "No, trans exclusion." And she kind of expected that I would know what it meant because you were still in that world of turfdom. And you taught me what SWERF meant, sex worker exclusionary radical feminist, which Meghan totally is. And then I just saw her rocket to stardom on the strength of her independent mind and her ability to call out nonsense when she sees it, whether it's whichever direction it's coming from. She's since decamped from Vancouver to Mexico, but still remains a vibrant presence in the Canadian public sphere. Her publication is called Feminist Current, and her video channel, where I've appeared several times, is called The Same Drugs. And I always wanted to know where that name came from. Maybe you'll tell us. But welcome, Meghan, and we're delighted to hear what you have to say.
Thanks for that, John. I don't consider myself the headliner, but thank you for that introduction. John was one of my first editors ever, and he's a very good editor, and he really helped shape me as a writer. So I would like to think that he did a good job, or at least an okay job.
Adequate.
Thank you all for coming. Big thanks to Chris and to Lighthouse, of course, for organizing and hosting the event. This I think is the first event I've done in Canada where I haven't been protested and I haven't had to have like a security detail. So that's nice. I wasn't like so stressed out that I thought I was going to have a heart attack leading up to the event, just regular stress. I think I'm probably at this point most famous for having been banned from Twitter for 4 years. I am back, it's been great. For saying that men aren't women, and also for referring to a man that you all might recall, or perhaps not, who'd been going around to local estheticians in, oh, sure. Oh yeah, you guys are all midgets, right? I should have known that. He'd been going around to local estheticians in the Vancouver area asking for a Brazilian bikini wax. And he was rejected on account of having male genitalia. And I committed the crime of calling him he. So I was banned from Twitter. Supposedly for life, but so last time I was in Toronto, I was protested by, the police told me, about 700 people when I gave a talk at the Toronto Public Library called Gender Identity: What Does It Mean for Society, the Law, and Women? As a born and raised, lifelong, until now, Vancouverite, this didn't relieve my ingrained prejudice against Toronto. Sorry. Even the police were terrified. I could see it in their eyes. After I finished my talk, I was supposed to be doing like media interviews and talking to people, and they were like, you gotta go, you gotta go. And so that scared me even more. They asked me if I wanted to cover my face and my head with a jacket to leave. They had cordoned off the entire block behind the library so that I could get in and out of the building safely. It was psycho. I heard from, many of the people who attended who were terrified. They had to brave this massive crowd of unhinged protesters who were hurling threats and insults at them. And so what had happened was, prior to my arrival in Toronto, 3 Toronto-based writers, Alicia Elliott, Carrie-Anne Leung, and Catherine Hernandez, you might have never heard of them, darlings of CanLit, they started a petition to pressure the TPL to cancel the event. And they threatened to boycott the library if the event went forward, saying, "We believe deeply in TPL's mandate to create a just and inclusive city for all residents." Clearly. And that as writers and poets, many of us have had the privilege of participating in readings and other events with the good faith and trust that we are extending TPL's core values of equity, diversity, inclusion, intellectual freedom, and integrity. I think it's clear that these writers missed that, in fact, TPL's mandate and core values are to support freedom of expression, which is indeed what City Librarian Vickery Bowles reiterated in response, explaining that while indeed my views may have caused anger and concern among members of the trans community and others, as a public library and public institution, the TPL has an obligation to protect free speech. Gasp. She pointed out that the community is asking us to censor someone because of the beliefs they hold and to restrict a group's right to equitably access public space, and we cannot do either. Doing so would also, she pointed out, weaken our ability to protect others' rights to the same in the future. It continues to amaze me that of all people, writers would call for a library to censor the free speech of anyone, never mind the free speech of me. Like, I'm just one person. I'm an independent writer, I'm a journalist, I have no power in this world. I'm just trying to talk about women's rights. I'm trying to talk about material reality, and I'm talking about the safety of women and girls for the most part. I mean, what has Canada become? The petition itself accused me of hate speech, claiming that people like me weaponize the phrase freedom of speech in order to get what they want. I think that's just speech. But they say it's an audience and space to speak to and then mobilize that audience against marginalized communities. So I found that comment in particular interesting. And I wonder what Alicia Elliott and Carrie Ann Leung and Catherine Hernandez would do without their free speech rights. Their right to libel me in public in order to mobilize their audience against me, again, one woman with no institutional, political, corporate, financial power. I'm one person, and yes, I speak up in defense of what I believe is right, of the truth. I speak up about my beliefs, even when they are controversial, and they mobilized an army of thousands to stop me from speaking. An army of people who hurled threats and insults at attendees attempting to enter the library, the public library, to hear me say dangerous things like, women have the right to speak about their sex-based rights. I also said things like, trans-identified males are male, and this isn't hateful, it is true. And I want to know what writer hates the truth. And what does that say about all of these people who were gathered together to endanger my life to such an extent that the police were terrified, and how they consider me the danger and the enemy in all of this? These women and these supposedly marginalized communities had the support not only of CanLit, but of the mayor of Toronto at the time, John Tory, who said he was disappointed that Vickery Bowles had refused to cancel the event and said that his office had reached out to her to pressure her to cancel the booking. These are the marginalized people. So he said there are thousands of places this event could be held in Toronto other than the public library. When it comes to public buildings, I believe we should hold ourselves to the highest standard and listen to the valid concerns of our residents. Not a word about the fact that one of the only women in Canada who was speaking out about this publicly at the time needed private bodyguards, a massive police presence, just so that she could speak about women's sex-based rights and say that men aren't women. Not a word about the fact that the key purpose, or at least a key purpose of these events, is to allow Canadian citizens and residents to listen to and speak about their valid concerns and the concerns of their neighbors. Not a word about the fact that I was not engaging in anything that could possibly qualify as hate speech unless you redefine reality, which is, of course, exactly what these activists have done. Again, writers, government-funded writers in Canada have determined that the meaning of words can be altered to suit their preferred reality or political narrative. They say that a man can in fact be a woman if we simply forget the definition of the word woman. If we determine that words mean nothing at all, who even knows what the truth is anymore? War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. One also wonders when these brave human rights defenders, these warriors fighting for the marginalized, who, let's not forget, have the backing of the banks, the corporations, the academic institutions, the media, the politicians, one wonders if they would ban 1984 from the library today, given the chance. One can only imagine what Orwell would have to say about that hypnotizing mantra, trans women are women today. So in their petition, these women wrote, while everyone has freedom of speech, we want to point to the limits of those freedoms when certain acts and speech infringe on the freedom of others, particularly those in marginalized communities. Acts like, petitioning a library to cancel a feminist speaker because she doesn't believe that humans can change sex, harassing and threatening and sometimes even assaulting members of the public who wish to hear what that woman has to say. I wonder if their literary brains can stretch so far as to see how easily their own words might be turned against them to suppress their freedom to attack, silence, libel, vilify, censor, and endanger people like me. To suppress their right to say, for example, that trans women are women. A decidedly untrue statement that has been used as a means to remove the rights and freedoms of others, but that they are permitted to speak nonetheless. What has happened in Canada that the left, the Canadian literary community, that those who believe themselves to be bastions of all that is right and good in this world use human rights law and language, the language of protecting communities and the marginalized, to libel, censor, and intimidate those who speak in defense of women's rights and in defense of the marginalized. So while I was visiting family in the spring, they've all moved over to Vancouver Island. Thank God, because I don't want to step foot in the city of Vancouver ever again. I connected with some amazing people over there, and I learned that the island was desperate to talk about what's happening in their kids' schools. The people that I met in that community were the same people who fought with the convoy for their constitutional rights and bodily autonomy, and they were well aware that they would be ignored and thrown under the bus by their political representatives, school boards, and the local media, but they were also genuinely committed to their communities and unafraid to organize, stand up, and speak out. Having come from Vancouver and witnessed firsthand, unfortunately, for many years, the way that the media class and the elitist, actually bigoted, in my opinion, progressives of Canada treat those that they consider not worthy of voice or representation or rights, apparently, then witnessing the abject hatred directed at Canadians who wish to spend time with their friends and family, to keep their kids in school, to participate in public life, to make informed, free choices about their lives and bodies, to speak the truth, to breathe. I had pretty much lost all hope for Canada. And like the convoy did, the people that I met over on the island further restored my hope. And they were angry that men were being allowed into girls' change rooms. And they wanted to know what their kids were being taught in school and why they were learning that boys who liked feminine things might actually be girls, and they didn't want their kids being referred to by opposite sex pronouns and new names in class without their knowledge. And these concerns to me seem reasonable. Certainly, these people should be allowed to talk about these concerns and have their concerns listened to by their political representatives and school boards. And instead, they felt silenced, vilified, and marginalized. In response to the 1 Million March for Children organized in Victoria, which I attended and attempted to speak at, the BC Federation of Labor, so they're representing the teachers union, the postal workers union, the hospital employees union, CUPE, beyond. They organized thousands to come out and protest the parents and community members who were gathered peacefully at BC Legislature on September 20th. And they labeled the rally anti-trans hate speech. So in a statement, BC Fed wrote, "The same forces who have been using fear, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and hate to whip up anti-trans bigotry are now coalescing in hate rallies in communities throughout Canada and BC. These rallies directly attack the 2SLGBTQIA plus community." and I'm sure there's extra letters by now, 2 months later, and the principles of equity and inclusion that are at the heart of labor solidarity. So as a result of BC Fed's organizing, our rally was shut down. And despite the fact that police anticipated not only that we would be outnumbered, which we were massively, they also anticipated violence, but they failed to prepare effectively and to protect us. So the counter-protesters almost immediately became unhinged as soon as the speakers began speaking and broke past the barriers that were set up to protect the attendees who wanted to have like a peaceful rally. They started throwing themselves at the stage. One of them cold clocked a cop in the head. So like minutes into my talk, the cops shut the whole thing down and they said it was too dangerous and they made us all leave. So in other words, those claiming an interest in inclusivity, in kindness, in acceptance, the love is love people used hate, bullying, threats, and physical violence, not just like the imaginary violence that words cause, to silence members of the Canadian public, many of whom are union members. Again, I want to know, who are the bigoted people in this scenario? Who are we talking about when we're talking about inclusivity and marginalized communities, if not the people ostracized, erased, and silenced by those in power? Ignored and slandered by their political representatives, by school boards, by the Canadian media, by unions, labeled as racist, Nazis, misogynists, and terrorists for fighting for the constitutional rights of Canadians during COVID lockdowns. Labeled as hateful for expressing concerns about what their own children are being taught in schools, labeled dangerous for participating in democracy and for attempting to have reasoned, open conversations. These are the same people who lost their jobs, their businesses, their rights, their voices, so those in power could make more money and gain more power. Who are these protectors of the marginalized protecting now? Pfizer, the government, the WHO, the man named Woman of the Year, the man breaking records swimming in competitions against girls, the man looking under stalls in the girls' change room. So following the September 20th rallies, myself and some local women and community members organized under the banner of Vancouver Island Speaks. And we planned a panel discussion and Q&A in Nanaimo. These were supposed to be, small community talks, just so people had the opportunity to talk about this, which they didn't have, so that they could see familiar faces, so that they could get together and know that they're not alone. And we booked a local space. And of course, the thing that's become the norm now happened again. Threats to the building owners led to the booking being canceled. And as always, we had to hustle to find a venue last minute. And the lovely people at a local community hall supported our event and right to speak, despite their volunteers who were like retirees, just volunteering to run the local little hall, being inundated with harassing, threatening calls, and despite their hall being vandalized in the middle of the night before by these activists. The event went really well, and there was so much demand from people across the island for more events like it, so we decided to do another, and we booked the Cowichan Community Centre in Duncan, BC, which is a small town on the island, but with actually a relatively diverse community as far as the island goes. Working class people, Indigenous people, there are, of course, the bougie types, but, there's a lot of good old boys in trucks covered in Canadian flags and Fuck Trudeau bumper stickers, so I was really happy there. While I had to be in Canada, that was a good place to be. But, it's another place where they're ignored by these bureaucrats and by these urban elites, the Victoria elites. And again, the fact that these people are ignored and vilified by the unions, and often their own unions, for standing up for their own rights and speaking in defense of their own families and communities is so appalling to me. The labor movement once fought for the working people, for the voiceless and the powerless to have a say and to have support in their fight for their rights. And now the unions are fighting those very people in defense of the bourgeoisie. So the Cowichan Community Centre accepted our booking. We submitted our poster, the title, which was to be called Gender, Inclusivity, and Women's Rights. And again, they were inundated with harassing, threatening phone calls, and so they folded. And they cited the BC Human Rights Code. So the administrative and facility booking coordinator sent us an email and said, given the likelihood that the purpose of this event is to promote or would have the effect of promoting discrimination, contempt, or hatred for any group or person on the basis of sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, or any other similar factor, it's determined that this rental must be canceled. And you'd think that, this kind of language being used against me by now would be something that I was used to, but I was livid. We were essentially being accused of thought crime. And keep in mind that we had filmed our entire event in Nanaimo that happened just a few days earlier. They could have watched it to see that there was no hate speech. And to claim an event aiming to talk about ideas and policies that impact children and families and women, reality, our ability to speak openly and freely, aim to promote hatred with zero evidence of this was unacceptable to me. And I think, like, in truth, the Cowichan Community Center is engaging in discrimination themselves. Against women, we were an all-woman panel who want to speak about and advocate for their rights and safety. So at the time, I wrote in response that, in fact, the BC Human Rights Code does not prohibit conversations about gender identity, women's rights, and inclusivity. And I have been backed up in this assessment by the case of Carolyn Bertjosky, an elementary school teacher who had been working with the Waterloo Region District School Board for 20 years when she started to feel concerned about the culling of books deemed harmful, essentially books that failed to meet the new woke ideological standards from school libraries, and the insertion of books that she felt were inappropriate for kids, namely one called The Other Boy by M.G. Hennessy, which advertises the transitioning of kids. So Carolyn explained during a board trustees meeting, she'd been given 10 minutes, but she didn't get the 10 minutes, that the book makes it seem simple or even cool to take puberty blockers or opposite sex hormones. And she was cut off and told by the board chair that she was violating the Ontario Human Rights Code. But she wasn't. So probably many of you are familiar with this case, but I think it's really groundbreaking what happened. So Justice James Ramsey, who was the Ontario Superior Court judge for her defamation case, said that actually the Ontario Human Rights Code does not prohibit public discussion of issues related to transgenderism, and in fact, it doesn't prohibit public discussion of anything. And he also added, which I thought was great, I find it regrettable that the defendant who is trying to shut down debate is an arm of the government. What happened here should not happen in a democratic society. This is my last time. Sorry. And again, I think this is groundbreaking. The Human Rights Code, which was amended in 2017 to include gender identity and gender expression, a bill I testified against at the Senate at that time, has been used ever since as a bludgeon to silence criticism and even questions about gender identity ideology. Human rights legislation does not exist to quash free speech. We have come to a place in Canada where anti-democratic practices, actual bigotry, hate, threats of violence, disinformation, actually though, the libel of peaceful citizens is treated as righteous, as morally and legally virtuous. We have come to a place wherein elitist authoritarians see themselves as bastions of human rights and inclusivity. Up is white, black is white, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, 2 + 2 of course equals 5, and men are women. So the thing that I thought I'd never see happen in Canada, though, thank goodness, is happening. And Canadians are saying no, Canadians like you. So again, I'm so glad to see all of you here today. And I'm thrilled to see the tens of thousands, more even than that, rising up across Canada to show the media, the bureaucrats, the academics, the CanLit grant princesses, the elite urban hipsters, the cancel Karens, as Michael Schellenberger calls them, the Justin Trudeaus, that we won't be erased, we won't be silenced, and we won't be canceled.
Thanks, Megan. Sorry to hurry you along, but wanted to make sure my guy Bruce over here has some time, just watching out for you, bro. Bruce Pardy will be our third speaker, law professor at Queen's, and also runs something called Right Pro, which is a law and liberty think tank. Before he comes, I just wanted to, there's an interesting epilogue to this library story, which I remember I didn't attend the protest or counter-protest or counter-protest, because protests make me very tense. But we met after for the fun part where we had drinks. And I think you brought some guy who was like a video game dude. He was like a professional video gamer. Yeah, okay, yes. So many men. Yeah. Oh. Awkward. You know what? I'm sorry. He was a graphics artist. He just had nothing to do with, yeah. Moving on. What's interesting about that is these free speech controversies, you kind of see what people are made of, because John Tory, who already was like very suspect on this file because he had been tweeting about International Menstruators Day. I don't know if you remember that. He put out this tweet, was like, it's women, but spoiler alert, it's women. So already he was like, John, what's going on? And then, because I know the guy, like I wouldn't say we're friends, but like, more than passing acquaintances. And I remember when he made this like, basically saying, oh yeah, Meghan shouldn't do this event. It's like, John, you used to be an AM radio talk show host. WTF? Like, it's not as if you're like some, associate professor in gender studies from OISE or something like that. You're a guy, your claim to fame is saying provocative things on the radio. And then Meghan comes to town and it's like, hey, we should protect female spaces. Like, this will not stand. Like, I mean, it shows the hypocrisy. Also, Meghan was too polite to mention, the CBC, by the way, CBC announced a 10% staffing cut. Sorry, I'm not going to cheer people losing their jobs because some of those people probably are not unbearable. This is probably a lingering effect of Trish not working there anymore. Anyway, but one of the reasons is because some of the insufferable people they interview, their point person in the protest, remember Gwen Benaway? Gwen Benaway, this trans-identified biological dude who, CBC interviewed this person several times. And if any of you have a phone, so Gwen Benaway, this marginalized person, had just won a Governor General's Award for their oeuvre. And if you want to see a sampling of their oeuvre, Gwen Benaway's claim to fame was a book called Holy Wild. And if you have your phones in front of you, Google the cover of Holy Wild by Gwen Benaway. And it's a picture of a stylized trans person with their legs splayed open and like these cosmic rays of truth coming from their crotch. And this was seen as a Governor General's Award-winning book. And if you read it, which I tried to do, it's it's poetry that's largely about their crotch. And it's like, if you're familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Vogon poetry, which like drives people, creates suicidal ideation and is used as a form of torture. And so this marginalized person, then the kicker is like, shortly after Gwen Benaway was the point person for like what women should be allowed to listen to, Gwen Benaway, who claimed to be Indigenous, was exposed as a pretendian, went to the University of Victoria to study transgenderology or whatever, because says, well, I'm a twofer, so, if I'm not Indigenous, I still got the trans thing. Then changed both names, first and last, kind of like Rachel McKinnon, Veronica Ivy style, and is now a taxpayer-funded professor in the genderology field. This is kind of marginalized person who Meghan was, I guess, successfully marginalized in your talk. Anyway, I just wanted to get off that my chest because, this is kind of every time I look at CBC, they go to this person, and so anyway, by karma they were exposed. Bruce, sorry for the rant. Please, I'm not going to deduct that from your time. I look forward to an august legal perspective on this issue. Thank you.
There's a quote. You're familiar with it. You will have heard it before. It's always trotted out at free speech things. It goes like this. I disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. It's from Voltaire, actually Voltaire's biographer, who was trying to describe his attitude to speech. I think the reason that it is trotted out so often is that people don't agree with it. And by that I mean, even those people who think they believe in free speech. Because everybody believes in free speech. Justin Trudeau believes in free speech. He has said so. I watched the video. Article 35 of the Constitution of China guarantees free speech. And if you ask pretty much anybody if they believe in free speech, they'll say, yes, of course, except. And it is inside the except that matters. And of course, there's a lot of blame to go around for Canada's free speech crisis. The federal government, the provincial government, professional regulatory bodies, school boards, and the list goes on. Conservatives, wait, what? Yeah. When conservatives were the predominant cultural power group, and I mean small c conservatives now, not the political kind, small c conservatives, traditionally, I'm talking decades ago now, were enthusiastic about censoring obscenity, about censoring heresy, and so on. But the group that I want to go after tonight, at least to start, are the feminists. I was scrolling through Twitter about 6 months ago, and I came across a clip of a woman throwing the first pitch out at a baseball game between the Boston Red Sox and the Toronto Blue Jays in Boston. And I gathered from the tweet that this woman was being honored for being the first woman to play NCAA Division I baseball. And the first thought that occurred to me was, but where are all the feminist protesters? I thought that men and women playing on the same field in sports was wrong, not safe, unfair. That, of course, is not what they mean. They mean it's unfair for the men to invade women's spaces. It's unfair for Leah Thomas to be in the pool. But it is not unfair for a woman to take a place on a man's team. That has always been the case for decades and decades. I don't know at what moment, and I don't know which part of which feminist wave it was, but I do know that at some moment in time, the feminists made an argument that stuck. And the argument went like this. We are equal. And we are special. We are entitled to all the rights and privileges of men, and we are entitled to special rights and privileges because we are women. Now, how does this play out in the space situation? Well, it means that, let's take a high school. Let's say the high school has 2 soccer teams, a boys and a girls. It means that if a girl is good enough to try out for the boys' team, then she has a right to a place on that team. But if a boy was to try out for the girls' team, even the boy who was displaced by the girl, that cannot happen. Why? Because it is a girl's space. And what do you get? Here's what you get. You get an idea that there cannot be any men's spaces. There can be no clubs that are male only. There can be no fitness centers that are male only. There can be no male-only professional associations. There can be no male-only firms. But of course, there must be women-only fitness centers. Of course, there can be women-only law firms. Of course, we can have the Women's Law Association of Canada. And of course, women's sports belong to women. So, my case is this. You want your cake and eat it too. Now, how does this play out with respect to speech? Well, it's very important because what has happened is this idea has become embedded in free speech law. It has weaponized human rights law. It is now a part of discrimination. Now, let's try it. Let's say you are a member of a hiring committee at a firm, a private firm to which the Human Rights Code applies. And during one of your meetings or on email, and you have all the applications for the job, you say, let's hire her. She's a woman. Any problem? No. No problem. In fact, good for you. You're in favor of social justice. But if you are caught saying or writing the opposite, which is, don't hire her, she's a woman, or now you're in trouble. Reverse it, try it the other way. Let's say you say, hire him, because he's a man. That's not allowed. But if you say, oh, come on, don't hire him, he's a man, perfectly all right. This is the way a double standard works. And here's the point about speech. This feminist idea has now come back to bite the women. Why? Well, because suddenly the disadvantaged group, the oppressed group, the victimized group, sorry ladies, it's not you anymore. You're just old and white and straight and cis. Instead, it is the other groups now who are both equal and special. You can say Black Lives Matter, but you can't say all lives matter. And God forbid you say white lives matter. That's a double standard. So how is it supposed to work? How is it supposed to work? How is free speech supposed to work? I believe in free speech, except, is there a principled except? And there is. There are principled exceptions to free speech. What are they? Here's the main one. Someone comes up to you on the street and says, I have a knife in my pocket. Give me your wallet, or I'll stab you in the heart. That's speech. We've seen no knife yet. There's been no robbery yet. It was just words. That words constitute an assault. It's a crime. Speech, but it's not free speech. You can't do that. The principled exception is violence. And that makes sense, right? Because we all have a right to be free from violence. So it is consistent with the other legal principles that we have. And there might be other couple of principled exceptions. But there are a lot of reasons people give now, and they do exist in the law, and I think wrongly, for excuses as to why your free speech is curbed. And here are some of them. Harm. Harm is not a reason to curb speech. Why? Because speech causes harm all the time. In fact, a lot of speech is spoken for the purpose of causing harm. For example, let's say you are a business and you're competing against the guy down the street. And you want to outsell that person, and so your advertising is lauding your wares and perhaps denigrating his. You are trying to cause him harm. If you win, you'll cause him harm. Or another example, let's say you are involved in a political campaign, and you are lauding yourself and criticizing your opponent. What do you want? You want that guy to lose. You want to cause him harm. The reason for speaking, in many situations, is to influence people's thoughts against or in favor of an idea. If harm was the criteria, then your speech designed to defeat the cause of the woke activists would constitute harm that was not allowed. So harm is off the table. That is not the criteria. How about hate? If you are a free person in a free country, you are allowed to hate other people. And you are allowed to say that you do. Free speech does not mean speaking reasonably. It does not mean speaking in the public good. It does not mean speaking politely. It means causing a whole lot of trouble. We have hate speech on our books. I don't think it ought to be there. In the US, which also has a constitutional right to free expression, their constitutional jurisprudence says hate speech is constitutionally protected. You are allowed to say how you feel. The dividing line is violence. You can't say, go burn down the guy's house. That's violence. But you can say, I don't like that guy. I wish he didn't come to this country. That is a statement of opinion. It's not very nice, but it ought to be allowed in a free country. Those of you who are working against gender ideology in public schools, I tip my hat to you. You are doing very important work, and I know it's very tough going, and I hope you succeed. But I must say this, the issue that you are focused on is not primarily one of free speech. That is because you are working inside the institution of public schools. And that institution, by definition, is not a space for free speech. It is a public system, which means it is a government system. Government-owned, government-run. Government decides the curriculum. Government hires the teachers. You walk into a classroom in a public school, you don't have a right to say what you want. Your children do not. The teacher does not. It is a government-controlled space. If you want free speech with respect to what your children are taught. Get them out of public schools. Now, I don't mean you should stop your work. And as I say, I hope you succeed. And I think that boards are infringing speech at school board meetings and so on, and that's an issue to pursue. But I think it's important not to characterize the overall issue wrongly. To finish up, Canada has become a fake, nice country. Maybe it always was, I'm not so sure anymore. Maybe it was always a facade. But it is a country that desperately wants to see itself as nice. Keep this in mind. The law and you are two different things. The law is supposed to be tolerant of opinion. It's supposed to be open to all kinds of people saying all kinds of things. That's the way the law ought to be. But it is not the way you have to be. You can think whatever you want. And the freedom to speak and to think applies to everybody. Which means that if somebody wants to wear a dress or call themselves a woman, they are allowed or should be allowed to do that because they are free. And you are allowed to express your disapproval because you are free. Freedom goes in all directions. And there is no requirement in a free country with free people who have free speech to respect anybody. Because respect is a thing that you earn. If respect is enforced, it's not really respect at all. And in a free country I'd like to say like Canada, but I'm not so sure anymore. In a country that wants and desperately wants to think of itself as nice, where nice is being enforced, you know you're not in a nice country. And, of course, you're not in a free country. Thank you.
Like 8 feet tall, Bruce? There we go. Oh, yeah, okay. That's normal size height. So we're going to be taking a short break, about 15, 20 minutes, so people can go get drinks and then come back, and we're going to have some audience questions. But before you go, I want to give you like an assignment for your discussion topics, because it's something we're going to talk about. Based on what you just said, Bruce, I actually think Canada is a nice country. It's just we've learned how to weaponize niceness. It's like, if you're a nice person, you won't say the following 17 things. And you will include the following dudes in your women's softball league at pain of being not nice, and you know what happens to not nice people. Bad things. So the question is, have we retained our niceness but just learned how to weaponize it? Answers on a postcard. Please discuss. We'll be back in 20 minutes. Bye, everybody. We're going to try and get to some Q&A in a little bit, and we don't have a ton of time. It is a school night, and so they're going to, we're probably going to wrap this up. I'm hoping we'll have about 20 or 30 minutes for questions. But before we do, I just wanted to maybe get some of the debate started a little bit with the panelists. I promised I'd play the role of devil's advocate here. Although in this question I'm going to ask sincerely, in my real human role, which is the idea that, like, so I've done, over the course of my journalistic career, I've done a lot of panels on things like, you know, free speech, ideological pluralism, things you're allowed to say, not say, censorship. And I've never once done a panel that was like, it's always like, what comes after the colon, right? Like, so it's never done something that's like free speech, colon, everything is all right. Like, free speech is always in crisis. Like, it's never not been in crisis. And so I think sometimes it's worth reflecting, is it really in crisis? When I started my journalistic career, there's people in this room, I'm sure, who remember it well. The big thing was human rights tribunals. You know, that thing with Maclean's and Mark Stein. The Ontario Human Rights Commissioner really wanted the power, as Alberta's Human Rights Commissioner did back in the day, to censor speech, stuff that appeared in newspapers and magazines and so forth. And we were talking about real censorship, because that's censorship, typically, the word applies to government action. And often when people talk about censorship now, they're kind of talking about Twitter mobs. They're talking about, like, you know, no one else in the faculty lounge will talk to me because, you know, they saw I was reading Jordan Peterson's book and something. It isn't really censorship. It's just people acting like dicks, which, like, that's, you know, it's, yes, it feels like censorship because we're social creatures and we don't like to be ostracized. It's in our social DNA. But, you know, sometimes when I reflect on this stuff, I wonder if people from other eras, you know, when, like, people were, you know, burned at the stake for saying the wrong thing, how much they would sympathize with us. You know, professional repercussions, you know, it always feels like you're being persecuted. And I think, I would say to the panelists, Meghan, you run a very successful YouTube channel and blog. Is Feminist Current a blog, or?
I mean, I'm mostly writing at Substack now.
Okay. But you're so successful, you're basically running your own media empire, is what you're saying. Trish has her own podcast. Bruce, you're employed by one of Canada's finest universities. None of you seem like you're suffering much. And we're here at this event, it's kind of like mildly insulting. We didn't even get any protesters. Like, I kind of would have liked to be censored a little bit. So maybe we could start off, and we'll maybe keep the answers brief, because, you know, I'm sure the audience has lots of questions. Are you not case studies in how people can be successful even when you're ideologically heterodox, which maybe puts the lie to the idea that there's a free speech crisis? Trish, why don't we speak in order when you originally spoke? Trish, would you like to answer the question first?
Sure. I make a fifth of what I did and would be making if I was working in legacy media. So, yeah, and actually, this is true. This is true. I as I said, I'm making a film. I don't make films for the same kind of people I did pre-March of 2020. I did a 5-part series for Amazon. I made a huge amount of money. It was a $5 million budget show. And I could not go back and work even in that environment now, because I would say things on set likely that would make people hate me, right? Because that business, the documentary business, and news in general, tends to be super left-wing culturally. So just being on set, I couldn't sort of discuss politics or trans ideology.
But that's not the same as censorship.
What, having to walk around with your not saying what you think?
We do that every day. I mean, like, we're social creatures.
No, but what I'm saying is that there are now platforms and venues in which I can't work. I can't sell the film that I'm making on the Freedom Convoy to Netflix. That's censorship. They would never touch it with a 10-foot pole.
But this city is crawling with filmmakers manqués who are right now boring their girlfriends about they won't buy my documentary.
Yeah, but they're not buying it because it's bad, right? I'm saying that there are ideas that we cannot sell, and it's the ideas that are generated in this room.
Okay.
That we cannot sell to mainstream platforms and make tons of money. I mean, obviously there are people on our side who are making tons of money, but I don't happen to be one of them. I'm just saying that if you decide to live in this world where you're saying what you think and not self-censoring, you're probably going to take a big money hit. And the places that will pay you for the stuff you produce, like the film I'm working on, are few and far between and usually less rich. I mean, Dinesh D'Souza's got money, but...
All right.
So I think it absolutely does exist. And I feel nervous in certain social settings even now.
I feel nervous right now.
Well,
but, I'm not going to say it. Okay, so Meghan, you literally have a bathtub full of money that you just like kind of roll around in. So you have Substack cash. Can you give us your perspective on this? Or maybe borrow Trish's mic if...
Is this working?
Yep.
Oh.
Yep.
You would laugh for so long if you had any idea how much money I make. And like you would. I mean, I don't want to complain about not having any money, but I mean, I literally could not afford to live in Vancouver right now. I could not pay rent.
No one
in
could
Vancouver
afford
right
to
now.
live in Vancouver.
But I'm not, you would laugh.
Okay.
You would find it hilarious how much money I make. And, you know, I would be making like a normal human income if I had just kept doing what I was doing before I started talking about gender identity and continued like writing. I mean, but then I would be writing for places that I hated. Like I'd be at like the CBC or something. Like I've written for the CBC before,
Right.
which is hilarious in retrospect. But if you will recall, I was banned from Twitter for 4 years for calling a man he and saying that men aren't women. So I do believe that is censorship. And, you know, like I mean, I'm not here just to talk about my own persecution, although that may have seemed like what I was here to talk about because of my talk.
You talked a lot about it.
I mean, what I wanted to point out was things like the Cowichan Community Center canceling our event by pre-accusing us of hate speech.
That's a good example.
Like, that's a thing.
That's a good example.
And the fact that Carolyn has won her case and that a judge in Canada has come out and said,
And Carolyn
actually,
is here.
no.
Oh,
she is. Oh. Sorry, now I feel weird that I've been talking about you this whole time.
Well, you know,
you
said all good things. So
I didn't say anything mean.
Yeah. Bruce, would you like to? Then we'll get the audience involved.
You're asking the right question, though, right? Because free speech is a legal term of art. It means being censored by the law. You don't have any right to be published in the paper. If the paper is a private company, they can choose what they want. So that doesn't count. It's the same kind of problem as with what happened during COVID, when you had private places requiring a vaccine at the door. If it had just been that business deciding they wanted a vaccine at the door, then that's their call. It's their property, their business, their space. They can do whatever they want, in theory. The problem is this, that as the administrative state grows, it starts to control and direct everything. And so that restaurant who requires the vaccine at the door, it's not doing it on its own behest. It's doing it at the behest of the government. And so with all of these other outfits that are censoring your speech. So, for example, in this country, we have the government subsidizing mainstream media, right? So when the mainstream media makes choices about what to say and what not to say, who to hear from and who not to hear from, it's not just their choice anymore. They're being influenced by government policy. Government policy and, frankly, the courts are also empowering all kinds of regulatory bodies who are also government in directing people what they have to say. The best example, for my money, is professional regulatory bodies. Doctors and lawyers and nurses and engineers and accountants and so on. Those bodies are requiring their members to either sign on to stuff or to not say stuff. And this is a huge problem across the board. It is transforming our country. And it is one of the main areas where the government, although it's not in the statute, you can't look up the statute and say, oh, there it is. It's not like that. It's being done in a much more clever way.
Okay, let's get some questions. Sorry, okay, we're just gonna get an audience mic, and I'm not sure we have a structured way of, I think it's the... Yeah. Well, you pick.
I'll start right here. Would you like to stand up? Do I stand?
Okay, thanks. In the past, Meghan, you've been eloquent about pointing out when people like Matt Walsh have rhetorically wondered, where are the feminists in the question around gender ideology? And you've been really clear about saying, we've been here the whole time, you're just not fucking listening. And I'm just wondering if you have anything to say to Bruce, because he kind of took some shots at you. Or did he not? Maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but I'm curious to know what you think.
I mean, I think he thought he was taking shots at me, but I've been a feminist for a very long time. And actually, I don't identify as a feminist anymore because I don't want to identify as in anything, and I don't like ideology, so I'm not doing labels. And I did very publicly and have for several years now been super critical of feminists and the feminist movement because they don't and won't support free speech. And they seem to think that their speech should be protected and defended and free, but not the speech of the people that they deem bad, who are saying bad things. And I just think I think it's so unintelligent. Like, I completely just lost respect for all of those people. It's so unthinking and, entitled. But, I've never in my life advocated for girls to play on boys' sports teams, so I didn't take that as a personal jab. And that was, like, the first I've even heard of it. I was like, is this a thing where girls are playing on boys' sports teams? And, I think, like, I guess I've never fought for that, but I would assume that if a girl is trying to play on a boys' sports team, it's because there isn't a girls' team for her to play on. So, for example, she wants to play football. Why would a girl want to play on a boys' sports team? That doesn't make any sense to me. But she sucks. Like, how would she compete?
Okay, Meghan.
Like, she wouldn't, like...
Meghan, we agreed you wouldn't talk about sports. We agreed.
I don't know anything about sports. I only watch UFC. And UFC is actually, I think, a very feminist institution.
Okay,
and I think
all
MMA
right.
is...
We're just,
everybody loves watching these women fight. And where does that happen in any other sports? I know this isn't an MMA panel, but I just wanted to give it a shout out.
Yeah. Read your contract, Meghan. There's certain no-goes areas. Yeah. We have the mic is traveling around, so you have to attract her attention now, Mike.
Just going to Bruce's point, I would say the precursor to men and women's spaces was girls in the Boy Scout, but I don't think it's not a blame thing. Where I'm going with this is that, there's a lot of people saying that right now that liberalism in general, and even the Enlightenment led us directly to this, and they claim that liberalism has no defense mechanism against something like the woke administrative state. Now, I'm a liberal and a classical liberal, and I want it to succeed, but I find I have no argument to those kind of people who say no. For instance, we know what we don't want. We don't want all this woke stuff, but it's not enough to say what we don't want. I feel like we need some kind of a positive vision. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, this is in a way the question for people who are in our space, because this argument has been made. They say so the side that's against the woke are made up of two groups: the classical liberals who want to be free, and the conservative-minded people who want to be good. And the good people think that you need to have some rules in society. And they're okay with a bit of censorship if it's the right kind of censorship. And the classical liberals say, we're free people. And so the positive vision that you're talking about is to make the right comparison between us and our opponents. And some people say it's individualist and collectivist. Some people say it's liberal and conservative. I say it's violent and not violent, because every single law is backed with violence. Every single one. Otherwise, it's not a law.
All right.
So if you have a group in society that wants to have restrictions on this and censoring that, you call them violence people. If people are free, then we got no violence. This violence is being imposed by the state in order to achieve goals by means of laws. You tell them they're being violent.
Trish, you mentioned you started your podcast, was it March 2020? So going to this gentleman's question, presumably, I think Bruce is passing you the mic there. He asked about a vision. Presumably you had a vision of the ideas you wanted to fight for when you started that podcast. What was that vision?
I guess I did it because I was feeling an onslaught of characterizations around COVID-19 that weren't true. And so the vision was to create a place where we could speak openly about data. In fact, the original slogan for the show was "Demand the Data," because all these things were happening without data. So that was it. I just, if I could just pivot from that a minute, because two things have happened that I think are indicative of maybe a mistake that's being made. One of them is the ARC conference that Jordan Peterson was involved in, which was kind of a lot of kind of hedge fund, neocon, rich people, the head of GB News, which is now silencing all of its people to figure out how we can be better than the World Economic Forum. That was one group. And the other one was Schellenberger and Taibbi, who did a big, how do we fight against the censorship industrial complex? Again, like a huge meeting of people, and it kind of ended with a petition or signatures or something. And for what it's worth, I think it's this. I think it's small community things. I don't think it's top-down rich people or celebrity journalists dictating how we should think about things. I think we just no one goes to church, we don't have community events, and I think that real poison was poured on our community relations during COVID. And I think getting back together like this is maybe the answer to your question about
civil society.
Yeah, I really do. Yeah. I really do.
Can I just add, John? We could spend all evening on your question. It is a very, very important question.
We're not going to.
We're not going to. No. We're not going to. But you stay on that question.
Yeah.
Okay?
All right. Yeah. Keep seeking.
All right. Just a question for Trish, but first, John, I just wanted to ask, what shampoo are you using these days?
Oh, yes. Too soon, man. Too soon. It's funny you say that because I actually subsequently got into this lengthy, soul-crushing DM exchange with Seth Rogen. So some of you, maybe there are people who don't know. I made this stupid dad joke about using dog shampoo in the as I say it, it sounds really dumb, and indeed that's how it was interpreted. And then for whatever reason, Seth Rogen, the comedian, the star of such films as Bad Neighbors 1 and Bad Neighbors 2, which were actually great movies. I really like him. I think he's a really good actor. And he came after me on Twitter in this deranged presumably marijuana-fueled rage, which went on for hours. And then for 6 months, that was my calling card. And a version of your witticism, sir, was directed at me quite often. I never stopped finding it funny. And what was interesting about that is because John Kay and shampoo were trending, I started getting these legit offers from people saying, "Hey John, if you mention our shampoo on your Twitter thread, we'll give you $500. And I was like, you need to fuck the hell off. I'm absolutely not in the beauty business. This is about my mind, not my hair. And that took over 6 months of my life. And then Seth Rogen started DMing me, and I thought it was okay, he's off his high, he's going to apologize because, come on, And instead it was have you learned your lesson yet, loser? And it was really? And it went on for hours, and I was telling him I really like your movies. This is kind of disillusioning. You're such a dick, and he kept saying, but I really put you in your place. You're a celebrity. You should be going out cutting ribbons in fancy bars and stuff. Instead, you're tweet DMing with some third-rate dude in Canada, and it just destroyed my. I guess you, Trish, we need to fight back against celebrities. One comedian at a time. So thank you, sir, for letting me vent about that. It's Pantene Pro.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Also, I, like you, I'm disappointed there weren't any protests. I thought for sure that... 'cause
I know.
a lot of trans rights advocates followed.
I
you,
know.
I'm sure.
It's
But anyway, my question just for Trish was, I was really surprised a little while ago I saw at a Toronto theater, I can't remember which one, but I saw the 2000 Mules, Dinesh D'Souza's documentary about the election steal, which, I think is complete nonsense. I don't believe in it at all. But somehow that got distributed. So I just don't understand why something like that you have done, it doesn't have a possibility of getting distribution.
I'm not saying, it's a perfect, and Dinesh makes a lot of money. I mean, his films, and I think that What is a Woman, the Matt Walsh thing made a lot of money. I'm just saying that I'm not, that the pie is huge and that there are slices for conservative people to make money. I'm not even particularly conservative. I don't know what the fuck I am. Like I'm one, I don't know what I am. I really don't. I couldn't say. So I don't have access to the same kind of places and money and profile and marketing. And would Dinesh D'Souza fund the trucker film? Probably. Would I want him controlling the narrative? No, I wouldn't. So I mean, they make money, but it's not the same. In the old days I would go out, we could pitch it to 30 people, right? But not the stuff we're working on now. I think it may change a bit, but right now it's still difficult.
So I got a question right here from Catherine.
Hey, Megan, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. We actually share a lot of the same opinions, but one of the things that I actually haven't heard you speak specifically too much about it, so I'm not too aware, but my understanding, and please forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think that you're on the side of perhaps banning pornography, and I'm curious how you reconcile that within the framework of classical liberalism and free speech.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, I mean, my position on pornography is that I see it as a form of prostitution. So my position on prostitution is that I support something called the Nordic model, which criminalizes the purchase of sex. So it criminalizes johns, it criminalizes brothel owners, and it criminalizes pimps and traffickers. And I don't see pornography as a form of speech. I know that this is a big thing, especially among libertarians and obviously some liberals, and I think it's a worthwhile debate to have.
I mean,
but
expression,
I think that,
like it's a way of expressing yourself.
Right, but so what I'm saying is that these are actual people and actual bodies, and so I don't think that prostitution constitutes a form of expression or speech. I think that we know that billions and billions of women and girls all around the world are abused and exploited and murdered in prostitution daily. And so I think we treat it the same way as we treat any other exploitative industry. I mean, imagine if you applied, for example, workplace sexual harassment, health and safety policy to porn sets. Porn would be over. I think that would be actually a good solution to porn. Is apply these workplace safety, sexual harassment laws to pornography. I think it would be hilarious, to be honest. But it's not so simple to me as just like censor it, ban it. First of all, because I think you can't, but that's not really what I've argued. But I have made a number of arguments against men paying women for sex, paying for access
Bruce,
to women's bodies.
Stay in your lane, Bruce.
Oh, I am in my lane.
Okay. All right.
We already have a basic idea in the law, which is that you require consent in order to touch somebody, whether it's sexual or otherwise. So if pornography is made without consent, then that's a crime, and that should be remedied. But that doesn't mean that all pornography is done without consent, just in the same way that all sex is not done without consent. I can sure you can imagine that over the face of the planet today, there's a lot of sex going on without consent. And that's a bad thing. But we don't leap to the conclusion that therefore sex must be illegal. In those instances where there is no consent, you pursue that and you fix it. To say that prostitution, the sale of prostitution is going to be legal, but the purchase of it is going to be illegal, is like saying that you can sell cheese, but you can't buy it. That means that you've put the seller of the cheese in an impossible situation where they have no customers. So either you're approving of the transaction, which you should, because if it's between consenting adults, it ought to be free, or you're condemning it. But you can't condemn one side of a transaction because the transaction consists of two sides.
Well, I think you can't consent to abuse and you can't consent to violence. And so that's what we're arguing so often when we're talking about consent in prostitution and pornography, is that if this woman gets paid, then it's okay to abuse her, to degrade her, to injure her in various ways, and then that you can continue selling those images and those videos online for all of eternity, whether she consents or not. So I think the issue around consent is more complex than just yes or no.
If she hasn't
and
given
we do know also that, of course, there is a ton of coercion that happens in the porn industry and in the sex trade, and that it's not really regulated in any way at all.
If there's no consent, then it is
But in any case, it's not a free speech
I'm
issue.
just going to interrupt this.
If
for
there's no
the-
consent, then it is already illegal, is my point.
Okay. I'm just going to interrupt for you in order to plug my own website. So I'm not going to pretend I'm on anyone's side. This is just crass self-interest. Julie Bindel. Megan, you must know who Julie Bindel is. Yeah. She was recently in Toronto. She's writing a book about this subject, exactly this. Bruce, you should read it, about this subject and many others like it. It's with particularly focused on lesbian rights, but about feminism more generally. And she came to my house and we recorded a great podcast a few days ago. I actually just uploaded it to the Quillette website. Why, what's Quillette, you ask? It's like Gillette, but Quillette.com. And if you want to listen to the Julie Bindel podcast, it's there. You know, that's it. That's the end of the pitch for Quillette, but it was a nice way to end this thing. Sorry, by the way, that, like this gentleman's question over here, that discussion could go on all night, but we only have about 15 minutes left for questions. And I believe we have another.
Hello? Is this thing on? I'm going to go there, and I'm sort of sorry, but I need your help. So we have a prof at Laurier, Sarah Hutchinson. Jessica Hutchinson? Jessica Hutchinson.
Oh, yeah.
Who came out right after October 7th with a hearty support for Hamas. And a group of us signed an open letter to the president of Laurier saying if she's attacked for her speech, she should be protected as much as possible by the university. And that the university should consider institutional neutrality in future. And we had a rabbi reach out to us passionately deploring the fact that we didn't take a position condemning Hamas. And we tried desperately to explain to him like the Skokie case, and he just, he couldn't accept it. And we couldn't explain it to him. And he kept reiterating that we had to do everything within our power to condemn the evil that occurred that day, to the point of kind of browbeating us to do it. And I don't know what you make of that. Curious, how you would have guided us in responding to him.
So, by the way, that's a great question, and I would just generally say that, this event was planned months ago, so it's, obviously there's been a lot of news items since then, but if you look on social media right now, there are a whole bunch of leftists who are saying that the censorship forces are now coming from, as they would describe them, Zionists and, anti-Palestinian bigots and people who won't let the Jessica Hutchinsons of the world. By the way, if anyone wants to see what Jessica Hutchinson said, I just now retweeted on my own account her actual words, which were actually quite disgusting. But Bruce, you said people should be free to say disgusting things. And I know many conservatives who now are the ones who are saying that this professor needs to shut up, and this student needs to shut up, and this student group needs to shut up. And I gotta say, in some cases, I'm kind of sympathetic. You know, at McGill University in Montreal, you had a group called SPHR, which called the October 7th terrorists heroic. They use the term heroic. And when I see something like that, I'm like, yeah, that's a pretty strong argument for censorship. Is there a fair case for saying that it is, I mean, not every Zionist is right-wing and not every person who's right-wing is Zionist, but there does tend to be a correlation. Can it be fairly said that in the period between when this event was organized and now, that you've seen a swing towards censorial forces being exerted against social justice leftists who are expressing strident opinions in favor of Hamas violence?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think there have been calls for censorship, and I've seen expressions on this topic that I would have characterized on the one hand as over the line in terms of advocating violence, which should legitimately be censored or punished, and lots of expressions of support for the Palestinian situation, which people will object to and find appalling. I found some of them appalling, absolutely appalling, and yet not crossing the line into violence. And those are really good examples of that Voltaire idea. Look, I hate what you said. I condemn it in the strongest possible terms, but insist that you have the right to say it, unless you advocate for violence. And sometimes there are going to be cases, and this happens in the law all the time, there are cases where you don't know where the line is. It's going to be gray. And you have to take the rule and the facts and try and figure out whether or not the facts fit inside the rule or not. And sometimes not that obvious. But to the actual situation, I think if I understand it correctly, I totally agree with your approach. Universities, in theory, ought to be neutral institutions, right? They only ought to house the faculty and the students. The problem is, of course, that for a long period of time they have not been. They've taken stances on all kinds of things, and it's just a little bit hypocritical to suddenly insist that, oh, well, we can't get into this because it's political. Come on, you did that and that and that and that and that, and now you decide you can't be political. Well, I appreciate it now, but you should have done it before. And we'll see if they go back to it. But the rabbi, just to finish this off, look, the rabbi is allowed to browbeat you, right? He's allowed to say that, in his opinion, you should stand up against that speech. That's totally okay. That's totally fine. Okay.
You mentioned Skokie, and one of the meetings about this event, because we knew this was going to come up, we talked about Skokie, and I'm really glad you mentioned it, because I've been taking a bit of a browbeating, even with people who listen to my show. Some are more conservative than I am, and they don't want to hear anything that isn't very, I'll just say, pro-Israel at this point, and leave it at that. Because there's almost no way to talk about this without making people really upset and angry. So it's hard. And it's hard to be a journalist around that. I've been there. I've covered the region. I have some expertise about it, but people don't want to know that. They just want to think what they think. And for me, the scary part of this, in all of the things we talk about, COVID, vaccines, the trans stuff, the attacks on Meghan, I am more scared now for free speech over this issue than I have been in 10 years, because people I admire are saying ridiculous things. And Skokie was ugly, but the ACLU was right. Skokie is, if you don't know, Nazis wanted to march through a neighborhood in Skokie, Illinois, where Jewish people lived. And the ACLU fought for their right to do so. It was ugly and it was horrible, but we do not have free speech if we cannot protect the things we find abhorrent. Full stop. And where I feel we're losing that in this moment right now, I feel it very, very strongly, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah.
Hi. So, a couple of things. First of all, Professor Pardy, you drive me nuts. Because half the time I agree with you, and the other time I just want to punch you, but no violence. But I want to follow up on this issue about, this story, not the situation that's in the news right now and is dividing people. One of the things I'm really concerned about now, in terms of talking to Jewish friends who live in Israel, and also Jewish friends here in Canada. And I'm not Jewish, I'm a Gentile, but I am really, really concerned that there is passive censorship going on around some of these issues by the government itself or agents of the government. And not just in terms of this issue, in terms of trans ideology. I'm thinking about what happened. I'm most familiar with the Anglosphere, so what's going on in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, here in Canada, United States. What is it? Peace, order, and good government is not actually being observed and maintained and sustained by governments in these Western democracies where a certain point of view is being allowed to be spoken much more freely than other points of view. And I'm talking about law enforcement, being on a particular, if you look at what's gone on with the Metropolitan Police in London, in the UK, it's outrageous as far as I'm concerned. Absolutely outrageous. And one of the things I'm really fearful for in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, what my grandchildren are going to be growing up in, is that free speech is going to take a whole new turn, and it actually is going to turn into what the government thinks is okay. And I think we have to fight against that. And I know that we've talked about COVID, we've talked about the truckers, but when I look at the Israel-Palestine situation right now and the free speech around that, as far as I'm concerned, there is no free speech in the public domain for one side of it. I'm just asking what you think. Sorry.
I agree with you. And I think what your question touches on is the dominance today of what we call the administrative state. The government has become so big and directs so much that, both the legislature and the courts empower the administrative agencies to do as they think best. They control their own processes, they instruct their own employees, and the courts are very reluctant to intervene. And so, even though you don't, and this is the way law is starting to work in this era. We have an old idea of the law in our heads, wherein the legislature meets, they pass a bill, and the rules are in the statute. You look it up and you see what the rules are. And as long as there's no censorship in those rules in the statute, you think, well, we're clear. That's not the way it works now. The legislature creates these agencies and empowers them to do as they think best. And then they do what they think best, and sometimes it's written down and sometimes it's not, but they act. And then we try to complain about it to the courts or whoever else. The courts are not interested for the most part. They defer to the administrative state powers to do
Bruce,
as they think best.
The courts were pretty interested in what Carolyn had to say.
Well, not so much, though.
Well, I
Hold
don't.
on.
Did you read the decision?
I read both decisions.
All right.
And there are two, right? There's one on the defamation action and there's one on the judicial review. The judicial review is what I'm talking about. So let's just take the first one. Defamation, the defamation decision, which was the good one, was in response to a motion to dismiss her defamation suit. That was the great one. There's really good language in there. The second one is a judicial review to do exactly as I'm describing here. The judicial review is an application to a court to review and quash the decision of the school board. And in that case, The court said, no way.
That's not a free speech issue.
Well, she was shut down speaking at the...
Yeah, but she
Right.
was shut down, but then she was able to get back at the school board through their misrepresentation of what she was doing.
Yeah,
and
but
what she was saying.
the point is that challenging the actions of an agency is very, very difficult. And if they have rules in place, they can control their own process, is the point. And that is the case whether it's a school board, a professional regulatory body, or law enforcement. They are a power unto themselves. And the courts are very reluctant to interfere. And because a lot of these things, exactly as you say, are being created and enforced by these agencies, there is no way, in a democratic sense, to challenge what they do.
I think we have time for one more question.
What's that? Oh, thank you. Okay, trying to be brief here. I'm very grateful that Lighthouse has put this together tonight. Really great to see everybody up there. Thank you for coming. My question is this. In the attempt to honor free speech at all costs, what matters more, the truth or free speech? And I use pronouns as the example, because for me, truth trumps all. Sorry to use the word Trump. So I want to tell the truth, always and always. And so pronouns are not true, and so I can't do it, and I won't do it. Thoughts?
Oh, well, that's different, though. You have free speech, so you don't have to use pronouns. That's a violation of your free speech. Somebody else can, though. That's their free speech. Okay, so you asked a very good question, truth or free speech? Okay? Truth is not the criteria for speech. If you want to go outside and claim that there is no such thing as gravity, you go right ahead. Now, you have to suffer the consequences because there is gravity, but that doesn't mean you can't say so. Fake news
Bruce,
is free speech.
let's bring this to maybe a point we started with, because Trish, if we could get Trish in on this, and then Megan, maybe you can get the last word. We started, Trish, you devoted a lot of your original talk to the question of vaccines and such. What about speech that is pseudoscientific and leads people to take quack remedies and kills people through, I mean, we've all heard stories. People in this room probably disagree about what qualifies as a quack remedy, but we all agree that there are certain remedies that definitely should be classified as dangerous, unscientific quack remedies. Using that specific example, could you address that question?
Yeah, that's a tough one and a smart one. And I wouldn't censor the speech. The problem we have is that the information world that we inhabit now is so dysfunctional that a platform that runs things that actually are ridiculous can be perceived by people as being as credible as a place that actually is researching and reporting accurately on science. So I don't believe in shutting those people up. I do believe in creating a landscape where people are maybe naturally directed somehow to things that are better for them, but I don't think that's the role of the state either. I just think the whole thing is completely insane. People curate their news and podcasts to their biases. So they live in one world that's all this idea, and these guys all curate on this idea, and so they're literally inhabiting different worlds with different information. That is bad. And I've said on my show a couple of times, we have to get back to almost a Walter Cronkite model. I know that's hokey, but where people are maybe getting their information from a place that we all agree is truthful, right? But we don't have that right now. So that's one of the reasons nobody's getting along, because somebody lives on Mars and somebody lives on, the moon, informationally speaking. So I know that's a roundabout way. I wouldn't censor the snake oil person, but I would try to find a way to make the platforms that give him the time of day are maybe less credible. The National Enquirer, for instance, right? That existed, we knew. what they were about. They actually got a lot of stuff right, but
They got stuff right. So Megan, you got the last word, and then our organizer is going to come and say some parting sentiments. Megan, I don't want to put you on the spot, but truth versus freedom, 30 seconds, go.
I mean, I don't think that we have to choose, and I don't call men she because it's not true and it's unnecessary, and I don't think that it's nice or polite or respectful to lie. But I mean, I'm not going to lie. If somebody else wants to call a man she, then that's their prerogative, and I'm not going to stop them. And if a man wants to call himself she, then he can do that. But when we're talking about legislation, we're talking about something very different. Or when we're talking about collecting data on people, we're talking about something very different. And when we're talking about journalism, we are talking about something different. And what's happened, of course, is the opposite, which is that in journalism, it's been mandated that journalists use preferred pronouns, and many of these people do it by choice. And I think that these are unethical, dishonest, ridiculous people that should not be respected by anyone. And if they choose to present themselves in this way, then I suppose that's their choice. So I'm not gonna argue that anybody has to call themselves anything. But when we're talking about, government data, when we're talking about laws that affect and endanger other people, and when we're talking about reporting the facts, and you're writing a story about a man that murdered a woman or raped a child, and you're calling him a woman, that's a lie. And that should be called out in journalism.
Thank you. Sorry, I know there was a lot of other questions out there. We have gone over time, and the people at Revival have been so kind not to kick us out or even say a word. But I do want to respect that they also have families to get home to and other things to do, and we still have our meet and greet after this for those of you who are joining us. So apologies to anybody who had questions that we couldn't get to. Thank you. Thank you, Bruce, Trish, and Megan. Thank you for coming tonight and for speaking on these issues. This is obviously a really important topic, and I think we need to keep having it. Thank you to everybody who came tonight. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this down. I feel like, that's so much better. Thank you for coming. This is really good, and I think Trish hit the nail on the head when she said that yes, there's these big conferences out there like ARC, but it's this that's important. This is what we've lacked. And a little secret about myself, I used to be really on the left, like super left, like crazy on the left. I went to school, I studied Marxism, I did all the things, postmodernism. And this is what we used to do. And this is how all those ideas became so prevalent in our society. We spent years, I spent maybe 15 years doing it, but they were doing it already for 15, 20 years prior to that, getting together in groups, talking about things. And we talked about things, and we held conferences and colloquia and little free events and paid events and all this stuff. And eventually those ideas began to infiltrate society. And actually that was the plan. I know it sounds crazy, but the plan was to manipulate language. The plan was, you guys were talking about this earlier tonight, was how hot is cold and black is white. And that was the idea. And I remember at that time, I was a wide-eyed university student, and I thought that, oh, wow, this is amazing. Like, this is so smart, because language controls everything. And obviously it was wrong-headed. And look where we are today. And I think a lot of people in this room have also come from that path, so I'm not unique in that capacity. But I'm saying it because we need to keep doing this. So hopefully this is the start of something new for Lighthouse, for Toronto. Hopefully there's many more events like this. And those of you here that aren't part of Lighthouse, you can join. And if you don't want to, start your own thing. And that's all I have to say. And thank you for coming tonight.